Now, here's a question for you. Why on earth are we importing third world violence onto British streets? I'm asking this after the terrifying scenes in Camberwell in South London last Saturday. It involved people originating from the African countries of Eritrea and Ethiopia, and that's over on the Horn of Africa on the East Coast. Social media footage of the incident shows protesters wielding big sticks and clashing with Metropolitan Police officers. A total of 8 people were arrested for offences including violent disorder, criminal damage, possession of an offensive weapon and assaulting on an emergency worker, and that would be a copper. And on top of that, 4 police officers were injured. It was absolute bedlam on British streets with an imported issue that simply has nothing to do with us. And to discuss this, I'm joined now by social policy analyst Dr. Rakib Hassan, great friend of the show. For starters, a happy new year to you, Dr. Hassan. Rakib, let's start with the basics. There's never been any love lost between the Ethiopians and the Eritreans. They fell out since the countries were made independent of one another in 1993. They've always argued about their borders. That's an issue for their countries, surely. And yet, it's kicking off in this country. Not only this Saturday, but last September outside the Eritrean embassy, similar scenes. Coppers were pelted with bricks and all sorts of missiles then. Why are these battles coming to British streets?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say a Happy New Year to you too, Martin. But unfortunately, this is something that we've talked about before, and I've issued numerous warnings that we are importing foreign conflicts and territorial disputes abroad. Now, many of the tensions surrounding Ethiopia and Eritrea is centered on the Tigray region. In fact, there was a recent 2-year war involving the two countries, which cost the lives of an estimated 500,000 people. And the scenes that we've seen in Camberwell really demonstrate that when it comes to those foreign tensions, they're being imported quite aggressively into the UK. And as you mentioned, there were 8 arrests, 4 police officers were injured, with 1 being hospitalised. But Martin, this is an isolated incident. I'm sure you remember the large-scale public disorders in Leicester as well, back in August, September 2022, where you saw subcontinental-style communalism spilling out on the streets of an English regional city. So I'm very concerned that many of our politicians who've adopted a very pro-diversity politics are failing to recognise the complications that come with rising ethnic and religious heterogeneity in modern Britain.
And Rakib, we have you on the show today, not only because you're an excellent guest, but you've written about this in today's Telegraph, and the comments have been astonishing. People are absolutely appalled that these conflicts in faraway lands are washing up on British streets, and more than that, Rakib, they're appalled by the seeming police response to it. Because make no mistake, you know full well, if this were two football fan mobs, the police would be steaming in with riot shields, they'd be taking care of people, as we saw at Armistice Day, they'd be locking people up, they'd be getting stuck in, and yet they stand off to the point where the police themselves are attacked. Many people are feeling very frustrated that the police, because of this perception of being racist, if they wade in, the police are standing off, and that in itself is exacerbating the situation.
Well, I think that the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, I think one of his priorities really is encouraging police forces, especially in more urban, diverse parts of the country, to be more prepared for these kind of incidents and these kinds of public disturbance, which in my view does pose a threat to public safety in those areas. So we're talking about a police officer being hospitalised. There was also the Leicester disorders where, in my view, the local constabulary was woefully underprepared. And then also when you have incidents like the Leicester disorders, Martin, there's also the risk that you'll have protesters or activists, in my view, troublemakers, coming from different parts of the country, inflaming tension. So what you need is local police forces to really bolster their intelligence sharing processes and ultimately be prepared for the fact that when these kind of incidents take place, they may take place in a particular local area, but they could involve people from different parts of the country.
And Rakib, aside from journalists like yourself who are bravely speaking out about this, there's a fantastic line in your piece today. Diversity is anything but an unadulterated good, you conclude. And isn't that part of the problem? We have a story here which totally exemplifies the problem of multiculturalism not working, because we have communities that have no interest in integrating. In fact, they want the opposite. They're at war in their homelands and they have a mindset here of the same. They don't want to be friends with each other. They want to cause trouble, and they want to do it on British streets. And yet, here's the other problem. The media on the whole is shamefully silent about this.
No, absolutely. And it's very much wishful thinking to believe that once people arrive in the UK, they'll shake off those geopolitical tensions in their countries and regions of origin. That's simply not the case. Some do, but the reality is an uncomfortable number don't. And we've seen evidence of that. And the reality is that when it comes to the sharpest social and political tensions in the UK, they're usually between the country's ethnic and religious minorities. It doesn't involve the largely irreligious white British mainstream at all. And I think that when we're looking at how do you cultivate social cohesion, I think we need to focus a lot more on civic integration as opposed to celebrating difference, which has been the case for far too long. We need more robust forms of law and order. But crucially, Martin, we need a more restrictive legal immigration system, and we need a streamlined asylum system. It's worth mentioning, since we're talking about Eritrea, that has one of the highest grant rates when it comes to asylum application approvals. In fact, it's one of those countries when it comes to the streamlined asylum processing, where face-to-face interviews are increasingly being replaced by questionnaires. It's one of the primary countries of origin. So I think we really need to have integration at the heart of our immigration and asylum system.
Yeah, and Rakib, when you look at the social housing list, Eritreans are near the top of social housing grants, and that in itself speaks volumes. But doesn't this boil down to the simple issue that the multicultural dream was a harmonious integration where we share the best bits of our culture? London Mayor Sadiq Khan forever parroting diversity is our strength, it makes us better, and yet here we are, we don't have this salad bowl. We have cultures like oil and water that don't want to mix, and when they're shaken together, they're agitated and they want to separate. Isn't this just cutting to the nub of the issue? This notion that people will adopt British cultural values. The minute they rock up into the country, they'll become civilised, they'll become first world. It isn't happening. And when we see these violent eruptions taking place, it's a stark reminder that we have a big, big problem.
No, absolutely. And I think that the reality is when it comes to our post-Brexit immigration system, we're not prioritising the brightest and the best. Let's be absolutely clear here. When it comes to our asylum system, in my view, we should be prioritising women and children who are at major risk of sexual violence in their homelands, and that includes insecure displacement camps as well. What we have is an asylum system which is being overrun by male-dominant forms of irregular migration on the English South Coast. And the reality is also we have to be realistic about cultural cohesion. And in my view, we've had such a strong emphasis on celebrating diversity. We've had far too many politicians in positions of great influence who refuse to acknowledge and recognise that there are very real drawbacks which come to the rising ethnic and religious diversity in modern Britain.
OK, Dr. Rakib Hassan, thank you for joining us on the show. And all these sort of stories, it's a great shame because, of course, we have a very harmonious and integrated multicultural community in Britain. Prime Minister, I mean, look, the evidence is there. Communities, when they integrate, can be hugely, hugely successful. Yet stories like this show us that's not always, sadly, the case.